Dr. Schwelt, you spent a lot of time recently looking into something called sialic acids, and this is something that I have very little familiarity with. Tell us about why these are important and what you're going to talk about in this video.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. So sialic acids are a very important compound. Sometimes we can see that sialic acids in certain foods that we eat can lead to an inflammatory condition, and that inflammatory condition could lead to chronic inflammation or even more severe COVID-19. So we're going to learn more about that, and I'd like to tell you a little bit more about specifically what sialic acids are, and that'll help explain exactly where we're going in this video.
So sialic acids are a family of more than 50 members of 9 carbon sugars that coat proteins throughout the body. I mean, if you were to look at proteins in the human body, you might not even recognize the fact that they are coated with so many sugar molecules, because the animations that we're all used to seeing, for instance, the spike protein and the ACE2 inhibitor, whenever we see those being depicted on cartoons, there's never any coating for sialic acids. But in fact, sialic acids are sort of like the Christmas tree decorations on the Christmas tree. If the Christmas tree is the protein, the decorations are the sialic acids. One of those sialic acids is something known as N-acetyl-neurominic acid, or NU5AC. And you can see that there, the chemical structure of that above. That is the one that is primarily in the human body. Now, what is the reason for that being there? The quote is, "A major function of sialic acids and glycans on different cell types is to help the innate immune system discriminate between self and non-self. As a result, different tissues express tens to hundreds of millions of glycan chains per cell that are capped by sialic acids." And so here's a picture that demonstrates that. You can see here in humans, in this area, on the surface of the cell, are a number of different sugars. That's why they're known as glycans. And you can see that these green dots are what we call mannose. And then finally, when we get to the very end, here when we have galactose, what we want to look at are the very fingertips, if we will, of these sugar molecules that are coating the cell. And in this case, in the human situation, what we have them coated with is NU5AC. In non-human mammals, however, they are coated with NU5AC, but also can be coated with galactose and can also be coated with this white diamond, which is NU5GC, which actually is only one atom off of NU5AC. We're going to talk more about that and why that is important. Here's a blow-up version of it. Again, the white diamonds, NU5GC. We never see that on humans. We only see NU5AC.
And the reason for that, the reason why humans can't make GC is because they lack the enzyme that converts the NU5AC into NU5GC. And those molecules are so similar to each other. In fact, they only differ by one oxygen molecule. That's important because in humans, as humans get older from birth, because they lack the NU5GC, they start making antibodies against NU5GC. And so by the time human beings are 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age, they already have circulating antibodies against this substance, NU5GC, which it can't make on its own.
Now, you might be asking, well, why is this important? Well, this goes back to a study back in 2005 titled "The Mechanism of Uptake and Incorporation of Non-Human Sialic Acid and Glyconeurominic Acid into Human Cells." This is the GC that they're referring to. In other words, is it possible that GC can get into the human body? And the answer to that is yes. And what they showed is that here they have something called high-performance liquid chromatography. They can put the sample into a chromatograph and see when the different peaks come off. And AC here is in blue. That's what we normally see in humans. And GC here is in red. And so we can see here that a non-fed or just a NU5AC fed human is going to have a spike here with AC. And then when it is fed GC, we actually have 2 spikes. And what should that tell you? That tells you that if a human being eats an animal that makes GC, what happens is that GC is absorbed into the body, and that the body utilizes that sialic acid GC as if it were AC. and puts it onto the cellular surface and incorporates the GC into the cells of the human body. It comes in from the diet, it is absorbed through macropinocytosis, goes to the lysosomes, it then goes through into the Golgi apparatus, and then it gets placed and put onto the surface of the cells. So again, to review, 5-GC is a sialic acid that's only found in animals, but if a human eats those animals, then the GC, regardless of how well it is cooked, will be incorporated into the cell surface of the human cells, even though it doesn't produce its own GC. Now, why is that important? Because all human adults have varying levels of circulating IgM, IgG, and IgA antibodies against these Neu5-GC glycans, and that human anti-Neu5-GC glycan antibodies can interact with metabolically incorporated Neu5-GC to promote chronic inflammation, likely contributing to tumor inflammation and potentially cancer progression and also vascular inflammation. This, by the way, is exactly what they believe is the mechanism for serum sickness, where the serum of animals were put into humans and this caused inflammation. The term that is used here is xenosyalitis, xeno being different animal, sialitis being a sialic acid mediating inflammation. And here we have a human who is CMA negative. That means he does not have the enzyme to make the GC from the AC. So we have loss of Neu5-GC. When he goes out and eats food that has Neu5-GC in it, he gets a xenosyalitis. Why is that? Because there are antibodies against GC, which causes inflammation in the epithelium and also in lung and liver and colon tissue. And this can cause issues with atherosclerosis possibly, or even cancers that can be related to this. As they have found, there is Neu5-GC found in the endothelium and atheromas of patients with arteriosclerosis. Here's a paper that was published in September of 2020, probably lost in the din of COVID-19 news, titled Association Between Neu5-GC Carbohydrate and Serum Antibodies Against It Provides the Molecular Link to Cancer. This is a French Nutrinet Santé study. And in this study, they looked at 16,000 adults, all of whom had registered a minimum of 6 dietary records. And the ingestion of Neu5-GC was calculated based on the records of their diet and also the knowledge that scientists had of the food products that they were eating. I'm thankful that this was in a French population because they were able to take the dairy products and really break it down in terms of the type of cheese and the amount of GC in it. It was known as a glycemic index, and I've got it listed here for you, where 1 is the amount of GC that is in beef as a reference. You can see here that there are many cheeses that have a low amount of GC and many cheeses that have an even higher amount of GC in them. Cheeses such as a Torquay or Roquefort, dry cheese, etc. We also have here meat listed, where we can see that there are some that have higher amounts of GC, like sausage, pate, and liver, whereas there are some meats that have much less GC in it, as you can see down here.
Just to clarify, is Neu5-GC found in things like poultry, eggs, and fish?
No, Kyle. Neu5-GC is not found in those food products, and even though they have been associated with ischemic heart disease in some studies, the degree and the magnitude is much, much less than some of those other foods that we've been talking about that Neu5-GC is in, like red meat, lamb, pork, etc. And that's what's so tantalizing about this study and these studies on Neu5-GC is that it seems to explain the differences between those two foods.
Well, what they were able to do is they were able to do a quartile graph of the Neu5-GC intake. And you can see here that as it went up, the amount of meat, dairy cow, and dairy sheep and goat went up. Now we have men here on the left and women on the right. You can see clearly that the amount of GC intake was significantly higher in men than it was for women, something that's interesting when we go back to look at the risk factors for COVID-19. And then when they looked at the antibodies circulating in these patients, and of course there's numerous different types of antibodies to 5-GC because 5-GC can be in many different types of positions on the glycans on the cells, that when you added those up, there was definitely a correlation in terms of the amount of antibodies and the amount of food in terms of GC intake that was seen.
So this, for the first time, connected together in human beings, that the amount of new 5-GC in their diet caused new 5-GC antibodies to be elevated, and therefore may be the connection to show that these things are the things, in fact, that lead to this chronic xenocellulitis or chronic inflammation.
I want to ask you about BMI, body mass index, because when studies come out showing potential benefits of a vegetarian diet or at least reducing the amount of meat and dairy intake, oftentimes it's easy to try to poke holes in the research by saying, well, meat and some types of animal dairy are just very caloric dense foods. So people that consume them are more likely to have a high BMI, and therefore if you have a higher BMI, we know the evidence is really solid there that there are a variety of diseases that are more common. So how do you parse this data here to suggest that these sialic acids may have a role on their own?
Good question. So if we look at the Adventist Health Study 2, where they looked at almost 100,000 Adventists living in North America, what they were able to show was an association between dietary pattern and BMI. So you had the vegan group with the lowest BMI at around 23. And then you went to the lacto-ovo-vegetarian, which was just north of 25. And then after that was the pesco-vegetarian, followed by the semi-vegetarian, and then finally the non-vegetarian. And at each step, there was a stepwise increase in BMI. And this was an association. And the point you bring up is great, is how do we know that they're just not eating more calories? And that's the reason why they have a higher BMI. Well, what they did next was they then looked at the diabetes risk. And they found that the same relationship was there for diabetes risk, even after they controlled for BMI. So in other words, the same pattern going from vegan all the way to non-vegetarian. If you had a vegan and non-vegetarian together with exactly the same BMI, the risk of diabetes was higher in the non-vegetarian than it was in the vegan, even though they had the same BMI. And we know that diabetes, that insulin resistance, that a lot of these things are related to inflammation and related to oxidative stress. And so it's felt that even though the BMI is the same, and BMI doesn't take into account everything, but when they did the multi-regression analysis, taking out gender, taking out socioeconomic status, taking out all of these things, there was still a very strong relationship between dietary pattern and risk for diabetes, risk for hypertension, risk for BMI.
At the end there, you said at a higher risk for BMI. Are you suggesting that inflammation itself can be a driver for a higher BMI, regardless of calorie intake?
Yes, that's very astute. So that's exactly what the evidence that is now coming out seems to show, is that there is a vicious cycle of inflammation leading to obesity, and then obesity leading to inflammation. And this vicious cycle is unfortunately continued, and we don't know if it's the chicken or the egg, but yes, both can lead to both.
So the question then becomes is all of this mediated, or at least in part mediated, from inflammation? Well, here's a very interesting study that was published in 2019 in the Journal of the American Medical Association Cardiology, titled Association of Biologic Therapy with Coronary Inflammation in Patients with Psoriasis as Assessed by Perivascular Fat Attenuation Index. And what they did was they looked at patients with autoimmune conditions such as psoriasis who were on biologics. Now, biologics are medications that, by antibodies, reduce inflammation. This was a prospective study cohort looked at 2013 all the way through 2019 with about 134 subjects. And what they found was there was significant coronary improvement and reduction in coronary inflammation with biologics. What does that tell you? That perhaps a lot of the driving force with coronary disease and cardiovascular disease may actually be from inflammation. They say here that in this study, biologic therapy for moderate to severe psoriasis was associated with a reduced coronary inflammation assessed by perivascular FAI. This finding suggests that perivascular FAI, measured by CCTA, may be used to track response to interventions for coronary artery disease.
Speaking of coronary artery disease, someone who's received a lot of attention about coronary artery disease and diet is Dr. Esselstyn. Can you tell us about his work?
Yes, so Dr. Esselstyn is a cardiothoracic surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. I mean, his job is to operate on people with coronary disease, and there was a number of patients of his that couldn't get it. They were so sick. He was interested in this whole food, plant-based diet, and so he initiated this diet very strictly on a number of his patients who could not undergo surgery. And he followed them up 3 to 5 years later with angiograms and was able to show that cutting out all meat and actually cutting out oils, it was a very strict diet. He was able to show that he was able to cut down the amount of coronary events substantially in those patients that were adherent to the diet, and actually showed very elegantly that there was an actual reversal of coronary disease in these coronary arteries. Just remember that coronary artery disease treatment is coronary artery disease bypass surgery, or CABG. Here, after 3 to 5 years, we actually had disease that reversed itself. So it was quite remarkable.
I'm not a vegetarian, but I do try to stick to unprocessed meats when I eat meat. And I took some solace in a big study that came out of Europe in 2013. Can you tell us about that study and if there's any new research that sheds light on this debate of unprocessed meat versus processed meat?
Yeah, Kyle. So prior to this big European study, a couple of studies out of the United States had shown that both processed and unprocessed red meat could lead to increased all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. This European study, known as the EPIC study, was the largest study on diet and disease up to that point. Over 500,000 people in 10 different countries in Europe. It was very heterogeneous, very widespread. And what their findings were, at odds with the United States findings, was that they only found an increased mortality in those who were consuming processed meats and not unprocessed meats. And so that led to a big debate about whether or not this had to do with the processing, the salts, the other things that go into things like processed bacon, hot dogs, cold cuts, these sorts of things. And so that was published in 2013. But there's been some new light that's been shed on that, ironically, also out of Europe in the UK Biobank study that just got published this year in 2021 in March. And I'd like to go into that in more detail.
They looked at about 500,000 middle-aged adults recruited into the UK Biobank study between 2006 and 2010, with a mean follow-up of about 8 years. What they did, again, was looking at association. And so what they did is they looked at a number of different disease subgroups for both, in this case, unprocessed red and processed meat that was taken 3 times a week. And anything here that has a line that is completely on one side of this unity line means that it is statistically significant. So what does both unprocessed red meat and processed meat together 3 times a week lead to? It leads to an association with ischemic heart disease. It leads to an association with cerebral vascular disease, specifically ischemic strokes. It leads to pneumonia, which is something that we hadn't seen before and is interesting considering our discussion with COVID-19. It also leads to diverticular disease, which is not surprising. It also leads to diabetes. Once again, these are the same things that we saw with increased BMI. But the real question is what do we see with just unprocessed meat just 3 times per week? Again, we still see an increased risk of ischemic heart disease. We still see an increased risk for pneumonia, which is very surprising, but interesting, and not so surprising when you consider the new 5GC finding. It's also associated with diverticular disease and also, again, associated with diabetes. When we looked at processed meat more than 3 times a week, again, ischemic heart disease, we see a small, very slight increased risk of venous thromboembolism in terms of statistically significant, but not quite because the p-value is 0.06. Again, this pneumonia increased risk is still there. We also see diverticular disease once again, and once again, diabetes. What we haven't talked about up until this point is poultry meat, which does not have Nu5-GC in it. But what it did show was that it is statistically significant, again, for ischemic heart disease. So even white meat, poultry meat, is associated with ischemic heart disease. We can also see here that gastroesophageal reflux disease and, in fact, gastritis and duodenitis is associated with poultry meat consumption more than 3 times per week. We also see that gallbladder disease is associated, and also, once again, diabetes as well.
The data here suggests many potential negative associations between red meat and poultry consumption and different impacts on health. What about benefits?
Yeah, well, this is an associative study. And what we saw across the board with meat in general was a reduction in iron deficiency anemia, which shouldn't be surprising. There were some mixed results regarding red meat and poultry. With red meat, we saw a reduction in atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, which is an irregular heartbeat. That disappeared when we looked at poultry. So it was an interesting finding.
And this led the authors to conclude that our findings from this large prospective study of British adults show that meat consumption is associated with higher risks of several common conditions, but a lower risk of IDA, that is iron deficiency anemia. The higher risks are at least partially accounted for by higher BMI, and that's interesting. And some of the associations remaining after adjusting for BMI or waist circumference may still be due to other aspects of adiposity. Additional research is needed to evaluate whether these differences in risk reflect causal relationships, and if so, what proportion of incident cases for these different outcomes that could be prevented by decreasing meat consumption. So what they're saying here is that a lot of the driving force for association was seen with BMI, although BMI did not explain 100% of it. And I think that's interesting because we know that obesity has a vicious cycle associated with inflammation. And as we've just discussed, inflammation may be part and parcel with the antibodies against 5-GC.
And I assume the results from this new UK Biobank study help support the hypothesis of Nu5-GC and inflammation, right?
Yeah, well, because Nu5-GC is present in unprocessed meats, we would expect that if in fact Nu5-GC is causing inflammation, we should also pick up a signal in the unprocessed meats category as well as the processed meats. And that seems to be the case here.
So in summary, certain diets are associated with outcomes. Sialic acid and the immune response offers a testable explanation for why red meat is associated with ischemic heart disease and cancer. And while more research is needed, there is an emerging picture that is developing. I think the answers to some of these questions is going to be made known through this Covidence UK study, which is actually looking at dietary and lifestyle choices and the mortality with COVID-19. And I hope that there are more studies looking at this specifically. Okay, thanks for joining us. And don't forget to see all of our MedCram videos at our website, medcram.com. We'll see you next time.